Across the Sun by Jason Pagano and Bill Robinson. Chapter 31. A Second Interview. Clyde thought the other Tikis woman, Mitra, might not fear this man, Azaka, or his animal companion. Though the fatigued, pregnant woman had cowered before her siblings, mostly her brother, she'd not similarly reacted to this formidable predator. The large cat had just wandered over to Mitra, who rested a hand on the animal and even leaned on the cat to stand.
Is she a bobcat?
Clyde asked their new guest. The siblings all looked at her, then at Azaka.
Very truly,
Azaka said. He seemed pleased to speak to her.
Shelfie has guardian training and breeding. Matter of fact, the humans call the guardian animals primeval, but I suppose they're just cynical or scared.
The siblings all noticed how the halfling had pronounced humans. Niwa, in particular, found it slightly offensive and slightly adorable. She wondered if he'd pronounced it that way on purpose and figured it could go either way, considering his disposition toward the guards. Clyde was observing Mitra and Shelfie interacting.
Primeval bobcat.
Azaka chuckled.
Nothing scarier than a bad man and a big plan. They'll think what they like is all.
Mitra, do you know Azaka? Shelfie seems to trust you.
Niwa smiled.
Can I pet her?
Niwa, hang on.
Aiden stopped himself from protesting more. His instincts were so strong within him, not to act felt excruciating. He heard a noise. Niwa glanced crossly at her brother for admonishing her and noticed he was now staring up the road in Silk Ray's direction.
What is it?
I thought I heard talking.
Her brother said quietly. The road was obstructed from view beyond its first turn, but he continued to watch. Rukaryu joined him. Shelfie's pointed ears perked up as she also watched the road.
My poppets, y'all never saw me,
Azaka said abruptly. From his backpack, the halfling then fished out a burlap bag of rice and seeds that looked large in his halfling hand. He handed these to Clyde with an oddly carefree smile.
Wait,
Rukaryu said.
Poppets? Are you leaving? Why did you help us in the first place? Was this some sort of test? How do you know the Tikis?
A test? If you wanted a test, then you passed, my boy.
The halfling had barely noticed the elf talking. He sounded cheeky.
Like I said, more Silk Ray humans be coming, and Shelfie and me don't exist. Then you done aced the test, you get that? I'm sure you can think of something. Blondie's got a golden tongue to match, if y'all thinks he can do all the talking again.
Aiden only understood half of what the small man was saying. He didn't trust the halfling, but at least this hadn't been another fight ending in death. By the time he realized he was Blondie, the moment to appear offended had already passed. Rukaryu didn't appreciate being called boy by someone probably only a few years older than he was. He willed himself to not frown as he watched the small man gingerly mount his giant bobcat. The mage had waited respectfully for an opportunity to ask so many questions, but he was leaving just as abruptly as he'd arrived.
Oh, Rook,
Azaka said.
Those snacks, like all good things, are best when you add water. You agree, I'm sure.
He winked, then chuckled.
100 crowns.
Rukaryu stared at the halfling, assuming the wink had been an inside joke he didn't understand. Adding water to rice mostly made sense, but why would anyone add water to seeds only to eat them? The elf tabled the thought and longed for an opportunity to rest and read more of Saba's notes. Shelfie dashed down the road, and the pair were soon out of sight. Aiden wondered if that halfling would have taken the Tikis woman if his giant beast could have accommodated 2 riders. The siblings in their ward were alone once again.
I have so many questions,
Niwa said.
Me too, certainly.
Rukaryu was considering how alone he and his siblings had felt just a few days ago. Suddenly, everyone was in their business. Aiden felt similarly. They'd come to this world unprepared, and every day that passed without finding their parents felt like progress lost and diminished momentum. Now local issues were interfering with their already confusing lives. That he'd fomented some of this was largely lost on him. Her hands full of rice and seeds, Clyde used her tail to retrieve their human attacker's money pouch from her belt. She offered it to her brother.
Azaka is right.
Clyde said.
He saw you do it before. You can do it again.
She stood by his side, prepared to look like his personal property if people appeared. Aiden looked at his sister gratefully and accepted the money pouch.
He saw the whole thing?
He mumbled to himself, surprised. They heard men talking and laughing, and their lively guffaws preceded them far down the road. Then 2 men in padded armor appeared. They grew silent upon seeing the party along their patrol route. By then, the siblings had committed to acting nonchalantly, pretending to be resting from their travels and preoccupied with simple tasks. Ricardo was leaning against the mesa's steep slope, reading some documents. Niwa was playing with the locks in her hair, standing them on ends, then patting them back down. Aiden had his rucksack open, searching for something. Clyde and Mitra were sitting back to back, leaning against each other and relaxing.
"Where's your wagon?"
One man hollered. His outburst startled the other man, who stopped laughing.
What?
Aiden disliked the man's tone.
"Your wagon."
The man said.
We walked.
Aiden answered. He tried to recall all the faces he'd seen in town and didn't recognize the men.
Are those yours?
The other man pointed to Clyde and Mitra. Both Tika's women gathered the self-control needed to not flinch or look up. Clyde felt vulnerable without her dagger, which had fallen with her would-be assailant down the mesa. She then realized it was better if she were unarmed if the guards thought her to be property.
Yes, sir.
Aiden instantly regretted the reverence he'd shown them. He couldn't easily cast aside his years of genuine respect for Gorm and Saba. From the corner of his eye, he saw Niwa was stricken by the guard's remark.
"You kids camping out here on the road?"
The first guard asked with a small snort.
Just resting a moment. We'll go now.
Aiden replied, trying not to clench his fist or his teeth. He calmly stood and put on his rucksack, avoiding eye contact.
"And you speak for everyone?"
The guard asked. Ricardo had resisted looking up, until he noticed the men were scrutinizing the area, and he realized a large patch of the dirt road was wet.
Sometimes.
Aiden answered. The others stood up and prepared to leave. Both guards sauntered forward, examining large animal footprints in the dirt. Then they saw some blood. They glanced back at the talkative human. Aiden realized what they were looking at and gestured to the others to begin walking.
Somebody must be hurt bad.
The second man studied Aiden's face. Aiden tried to relax his shoulders.
I think everyone's all right here. Are you doing all right?
He extended his hand, offering them the dead man's money pouch. Making eye contact during this exchange was exceedingly difficult, but he found a reserve of confidence within himself as he'd found when getting Mitra out of Silk Rhode. The guard raised an eyebrow. He looked at the money pouch, then back to the human bribing him, then again at the pouch.
"I think we're doing just fine."
He gave an easy smile, then accepted the money pouch. He shook it to hear the satisfying clinking of coins, then pocketed it. Ricardo heard the coins clinking and thought of his father, just a few days ago, explaining why he never carried a money pouch. He missed his parents. Aiden exhaled with relief.
Do you know where the traders are heading after Silk Rhode? I might need to stock up.
Aiden was trying to sound confident, but felt disgusted with his turn of phrase. Calling them slavers or monsters would have been more appropriate. The 2 guards were already walking back to town. One stopped and turned his head slightly.
They're probably going to Blazes soon enough. Good riddance.
The pair chuckled and continued on. Aiden briefly wanted to ask where Blazes was located, but then he understood the gist. Chapter 32. Bare Necessities.
Clyde, what are you looking for?
Niwa asked. Her sister was moving around under the floorboards of the old roadhouse. The gnome was sitting with Mitra on the platform, looking out at the sunset. They were having a somewhat strained conversation.
A weapon.
The Tikas responded vaguely, rifling through piles of junk and busted crates. Her eyes attempted to focus with the little daylight filtering in through gaps and cracks above.
Oh, let me help.
Niwa replied as she excused herself and climbed down the open trapdoor's stairs. Touching down on damp earth below, she cast Create Flame, holding the small fire in her cupped hands. Although the light was minimal, she caught sight of a few small creatures scurrying away in search of deeper darkness.
The fire is dangerous down here.
Clyde said as she continued looking. She noticed the dusty kitchen knife in decent condition in a corner. She collected it and felt its heft in her small hand. Niwa felt a bit dejected, but she knew Clyde was not one to ask for help, and she never spoke from a place of irritation or dismissal. The gnome was about to cancel her spell when she noticed Clyde's face in the magic fire's glow.
Thank you, Niwa.
Clyde said with an earnest and penetrating look. She secured the knife to her utility belt.
Anytime.
Niwa replied. Something about her sister's gray eyes was so strange. Seeing them up close was comforting but also curious. She felt she could see into a void where secrets were absorbed and then hidden from the world to keep them safe. She imagined her Tika's sister had all the stray pieces of knowledge missing from the world, and maybe that's why she said so little. Niwa's stomach grumbled. Clyde stopped on the cellar stairs to retrieve the bag of rice and the strange seeds.
We should eat.
She said pleasantly as she found a cast iron pot among the debris, then ventured back outside. Mitra had delivered a litter before. She could endure a long day of walking while malnourished and dehydrated, but as she watched the sunset, she finally allowed herself to feel exhausted. The imperative to be alert at all times was the hardest part for her. Though she was barely older than some of these children, she had experienced more than enough abuse for one lifetime. The Tikis' gestation period was much shorter than that of humans, elves, or gnomes. She wondered if her new owners understood she'd deliver her pups in just a few more days. The father was a Tikis man she'd never met. Before her previous owners had sold him, they'd forced him onto her while the other slavers ate breakfast and watched. He'd been whipped with a belt if he stopped or slowed down as he raped her. She'd closed her eyes and tried to remember the faces of her young children, whom she'd never see again. It was impossible to block out the laughter of the men and the tears landing on her face as the forced mate finished inside her. Mitra almost allowed herself a moment to just breathe and relax. These strangers had said they were rescuing her. They'd said she was free. Then, without hesitation, they'd murdered slavers in front of her and bribed town guards. As such, she doubted their intentions, even though the Tikis child did appear to have independence. More importantly, one of Shear's agents had scouted them, seeking to help the children. Seeing that halfling rush to their side and later offer food gave her hope that her fate might yet change. Thinking about food made Mitra's stomach growl. It felt like a luxury to invest even a little emotional energy in thinking about one's next meal. She turned to see the other Tikis emerging from the cellar. The child gave her a penetrating glance before jogging into the woods. And then, as if she'd willed it, the gnome girl climbed the stairs carrying a large pot. It appeared her new owners, or perhaps traveling companions, had given her a little space and peace. This experience was new to her.
Rook, can you help me out with some water?
Niwa asked.
You know me so well.
He let his bookmark's light blink away as he stowed Sava's journal and raised a hand to cast Create Water. He maneuvered the pot to rinse it liberally with the clean water cascading from his fingertips. After he'd cleaned the pot and filled it with water, his sister also filled some wooden bowls before the spell ended.
Hold on.
Niwa reached for one of the seeds Azaka had given them.
Didn't that man say something about just adding water?
Ricario was shocked he had forgotten that comment, which had perplexed him at the time. He watched his sister submerge one large seed into the pot. The seed quickly started to rumble and expand. From its white shell, streaks of yellow and pale green began to coalesce on the water's surface. Within seconds, the tiny object had metamorphosed into a fruit with a hardy rind. Niwa retrieved it as the fruit was about to outgrow the pot. The fruit continued to grow larger and heavier. She set it on the ground, marveling it had grown to nearly the size of her entire body.
Are we going to eat that?
Niwa asked sheepishly.
I'm intrigued.
Ricario was willing to sample it. Aiden had been collecting his thoughts under the guise of gathering firewood. Today, he'd bought an enslaved woman, fled town, murdered someone, been party to the murdering of 2 other people, bribed even more people, and guided his family back to where they'd been attacked. He didn't want to be back at the roadhouse. Even though Mitra wasn't to blame, He was also stressed about protecting another person who couldn't defend herself well. He told himself gathering firewood was a good opportunity to scout the area for danger before they spent another night in an abandoned cellar. Aiden decided she probably needed some time alone. He knew she kept turning away from him, cowering whenever he was close, which upset him. Why would someone he'd freed be determined to perpetually act as the victim? He dropped the firewood he'd gathered at the base of a large tree and began climbing. The last time he'd witnessed an omen, he'd been on the roof of their home. Perhaps he'd see another bird of fire. He welcomed any celestial sign, even if he fell from witnessing it. Aiden sat on a high limb and gathered his thoughts. He wondered if looking up at stars while thinking about his moral compass and his place in this world constituted prayer. He decided to climb higher. The sun had recently set. He felt guilty. He'd been away from his family and Mitra for so long. They were probably waiting on more firewood to start dinner. His responsibility nagged at him. Clouds mostly obscured the waning moon, and no cataclysmic omen zipped through the sky. It was time to head back.
You don't need to be gathering wood fresh off the bough, you know.
Someone below him said. Surprised, Aiden nearly fell once again. He looked down but didn't see anyone. He patted his hip to ensure his new sword was there and hurriedly descended the tree.
I promised I'd be back. You lot sure picked strange digs to set camp.
Zaka held a small bundle of firewood. His animal companion, next to him, had one large stick clenched in her teeth like a canine that she wasn't.
I nearly fell because of you.
Aiden huffed as he dropped from the lowest branch.
Do be careful. Shelfie can catch you, but not so gently.
Azaka replied, not noticing the human speaking.
Let's go eat.
Aiden surprised the halfling with a pleasant invitation.
It'd be a pleasure.
Azaka said, as he and the bobcat started walking toward the glow.
I brought cardamom and turmeric for the rice.
Aiden carried his own firewood. He had never heard of those items.
You're gonna like them. Don't be worrying.
Azaka said, as though reading his mind. They returned to camp together. Chapter 33. A Curled Tail. Aiden saw Niwa was sitting next to Mitra, talking and gesticulating enthusiastically. The Tikas woman, drinking from a wooden bowl, accepted the company. Rukario was stirring the rice with a stick as the water evaporated in puffs of steam. The elf put his hands in his sandals, using them to quickly remove the pot from the heat. Then he wrung his hands together, water squeezing from them somehow before he shook them clean. He began portioning out meals for everyone. Across the campfire, Clyde stood over a large, round object with a kitchen knife. She was slicing into a fruit as large as she was.
What is that?
Aiden asked. Everyone looked up to see he'd returned with Azaka and his bobcat.
Oh good, jackfruit. What gave you the idea?
Azaka chuckled, dropping his firewood and sitting by the campfire.
I've never heard of such a fruit.
Rukario said. He delighted in all things that made the world seem larger. To him, this jackfruit symbolized discovery.
It's strangely chewy, but tasty.
Niwa said, munching on a bite. She looked around cautiously, embarrassed to have been so loud. She didn't want to compromise her family's safety. Rukario noticed.
It's all right, Niwa. If anyone were hunting or tracking us...
He glanced at Azaka and his large animal companion.
If anyone else were hunting or tracking us, they'd have seen the fire before they heard your voice.
Aiden recalled looking back at Silk Rhode earlier, expecting to be followed.
They must know those guys never came back to town.
Clyde thought to mention she hadn't noticed anyone else following them, but then she saw the halfling and said nothing. Azaka was sprinkling spices onto his rice. He then drew 2 chopsticks from a small bundle he'd retrieved from his pack.
Pass these about, would you, son?
He handed Aiden the spice jar and bundle. Aiden hated being called son by anyone but Gorham and Saba.
Sticks and a jar?
He asked. He was scrutinizing the fruit to decide if he were comfortable eating it or not. It didn't look like anything they grew back home in the garden, but his sister seemed to enjoy it. Al the halfling was eating the colorfully seasoned rice with 2 small sticks. Aiden left his rice unseasoned, but drew 2 chopsticks and passed the materials around the circle. After Ricariu seasoned his food and figured out how to use the chopsticks, he handed the items to Clyde, who maintained eye contact with him for an extended moment. Surprised, he returned the look, smiling. He remembered being a kid, watching his younger sister at the dining room table. If they were eating something Clyde found particularly delicious, her tail would curl up. She would gladly serve herself an extra large portion. He'd found it amusing to see such a large helping before the smallest member of the family. Clyde held a large wedge of jackfruit with several bites missing. Her tail was curled up.
May I please have everyone's attention?
Ricariu said. Azaka was giggling. He'd just fed a piece of jackfruit to his bobcat, who'd gobbled it up quickly and began licking his fingers. When he noticed the others had stopped eating, he looked around until he noticed the elf. Shelfie licked her chops and rested her head near Mitra, who didn't seem to mind.
I just want to thank you all for being here and sharing a meal. The 4 of us have been away from home for only 3 days, but the adjustment to our new surroundings hasn't exactly been elementary. This campfire, a palatable meal, and good company are some of the trappings I've missed the most. I think home is a state of mind, so this night together is really important. In fact, it feels like forever since I've eaten anything that required more than just my bare hands.
A few laughed, which let Ricariu end his slightly awkward toast on a high note and resume eating. He'd made sure to look at Mitra while speaking, wanting to suggest she was welcomed as an equal. The Tikas woman, sitting quietly by the fire, thought it was bizarre but inspirational to see such diverse children traveling and working together. She was beginning to regard them as capable young adults, and she was thrilled to be near Azaka, whom she'd never met but had heard of, the tiny man with a giant cat who worked on behalf of the Tikas. She wanted to ask if he'd seen any of her children, but didn't think the heavy question was right for the moment. While trying to be discreet, she drank her water and ate all her rice and fruit very quickly. It had been so long since she'd felt the comfort of being sated by food. Chapter 34. Smoke Rings.
I best confess that when I say I'll find you all soon, never did I think you would rest in a place like this.
Azaka wiggled a chopstick between his fingers. A piece of rice that had been stuck to it went flying behind him.
It was the only place I could think of.
Aiden said. He didn't want to overshare, particularly not while using Azaka's chopsticks to shovel food into his mouth.
Yeesh.
Azaka said.
Any shanty far from Silk Rhode be a better one. Plus, I done hear this place burned away some time ago from strange happenings.
Niwa had been thinking about Idzu since they returned to the roadhouse. She was glad the halfling wasn't asking why they had no place to call home.
Well, where you all headed in the morning?
What were the strange happenings?
Niwa wanted to redirect the conversation.
Pardon, love?
Azaka asked. He noticed the gnome flinch a bit after being called a pet name.
Be thankful y'all weren't about when a madman hits rock bottom. I know I am. Believe it or don't, but I'm not much enchanted by the likes of most people. So I did never see the night some real mess of a man done burned the whole place down, full of people to boot. I heard he was stamped to death when everyone did bust out of there, you know, it burning up and all. But what could I know, never minding this place before?
Azaka's anecdote benefited from the campfire setting. The story left them speechless. Despite claiming not to be a people person, the halfling appeared to enjoy the group hanging on his every word.
Wait a minute.
Ricariu held up his hand.
Are you saying some desperate man tried to kill everyone in a fire? That's horrid.
Aiden thought of their awful first encounter here. He hadn't looked for that man's body while gathering firewood, which made him feel reckless and irresponsible. He almost went that very instant to check, but took a deep breath and stayed put.
It'd be a shame, sure was.
Azaka retrieved from his pocket a rolled cigarette. He sighed.
I done heard no souls were lost save for the one sad fool. The dragon's breath ain't nothing but a craving and a curse. Y'all knew none of this before coming here?
He leaned forward to light his cigarette with the campfire.
Dragon's breath?
Niwa said. Her gnome ancestors had told her stories about dragons, which had evoked some fantastic images in her mind. The young summoner had always suspected dragons were simply folklore. However, the possibility of being proven wrong excited her. Azaka took a long drag of his cigarette. He'd missed the gnome's question, but noticed her bewildered look on her face as she watched him exhale and produce rings of smoke.
Oh, this ain't the stuff, you see.
The halfling explained quickly.
Grow me own, that is. The rest just be poison, and never you be starting on any of it.
Any of what?
Niwa asked. Suddenly, her face was aglow with excitement.
Are you a dragon?
Azaka nearly choked.
Ain't that waggish?
He exclaimed through a brief fit of laughter.
My smoke rings be masterful, true it is, but yours truly be no magic beast. You got a good wit.
The halfling flashed her a bright smile. The compliment pleased Niwa, although she wasn't sure what was so funny.
Dragon's breath be an addiction.
Azaka held up his cigarette.
This here ain't dragon's breath, but y'all sure did see others using it in stink ray. I don't be calling it silk ray, 'cause it stink like living death, you feel me?
The halfling smiled and nudged Aiden agreeably, though the human reciprocated with a look of mild discomfort.
When you need the breath, and there be none left to draw, well, that's desperation.
The halfling took another drag and looked thoughtfully at the campfire.
Powerful stuff it is. Burns away your right mind and leaves you begging to be the ash left behind.
Aiden thought about his recurring dream. He'd often seen his family and even people from Raven's Cross in it. There'd be a campfire like the one in front of him now. Then, a black cloud swirled around them all, leaving them dead, covered in blood. He'd always tried to minimize his restless nights. He'd mumble a few words about having trouble sleeping and say nothing further about it. Saba knew about the nightmare, but he'd always spared her the destructive imagery. Alarm stirred in him. Someone was getting very close to telling his story, his dream, as if it were a prophecy.
That's enough.
Aiden barked. Everyone flinched. Mitra recoiled, which prompted Sholfi to stand by her side.
Hold.
Azaka commanded the bobcat, gently placing a hand on her. He suspected talking about addiction and death was too much for this crowd.
Well, I'm heading north in the morning. There be someone I think y'all should meet. A friend. Ain't too many this far down, for sure. What say you?
That would be greatly appreciated.
Rakaru said. He looked at Clyde and Mitra to make sure his answer didn't upset them. They didn't appear overly distressed, and Niwa was smiling.
I mean, we are amenable to making new friends.
Aiden folded his arms. Rakaru was more trusting of strangers than he was, but maybe they could use a few friends in this dangerous new world.
Good.
Azaka reached into his pack and produced sticks with frayed ends, passing them around the campfire.
You only need the one.
The halfling instructed, seeing their confused looks.
Ain't you never used a neem stick? They keep the teeth nice and clean.
Aiden figured the simple stick must be some natural answer to the mouth brushes Saba had made for them back home. Had any of his siblings packed their mouth brushes? He didn't think so, which made him realize they'd subconsciously believed they'd be returning home. He clenched the stick in his fist. His siblings were expressing some satisfaction using their neem sticks. Mitra had accepted the item gladly and knew how to use it. After tossing the used stick into the fire, she noticed Clyde staring at her. The Tikas shared an affirming glance. Despite having a winning smile, Azaka didn't clean his own teeth after the meal. Aiden, watching him tilt his head back and puff out more smoke rings, grew skeptical. Was this chance encounter with the halfling some sort of elaborate hoax? Nothing in this world made sense to him. He wanted to trust Azaka. Trust would make protecting his family against a stranger with a giant bobcat much easier. Chapter 35. No Trespassing. Clyde felt strange traveling in the center of the group, surrounded by her siblings and these new people they had met the day before. When they'd traveled together back home, even if they hadn't felt in danger, she'd often orbit her siblings and monitor their surroundings. That had made her feel more secure and had also occupied her mind. For now, though, she stayed beside Mitra in the center of the group as they walked beside the primeval bobcat. By the time the sun had risen, they'd left the roadhouse area. Azaka led the group through a densely forested valley peppered with jagged rocks protruding from the ground. He also explained regrettably that an expectant mother should not ride an animal due to the risk of jostling or falling. The group traveled slowly and rested as needed. The halfling often pointed out distant wildlife or noteworthy natural deposits. Aiden traveled alongside Azaka. He wanted to let the halfling lead, but also observe him closely. Azaka's casual demeanor as they wandered the wilderness concerned him.
When will you trust us enough to tell us who we are going to meet?
Aiden said, irritated. Earlier that morning, he'd been more straightforward, asking,
Where are we going?
And,
Who are we going to meet?
but Azaka had answered with lighthearted non sequiturs or silence.
It's not that I don't trust y'all, but my colleague depends on her privacy. That's why we're going to meet at a neutral place.
Does she know we're on our way?
Niwa called from the rear of the group. She preferred holding her doha as she walked. Aiden repeated his sister's question. He felt silly moving ahead, then walking backwards to make sure the halfling noticed him when he spoke.
She got magic for that. Don't you worry one bit about that. There'll be all sorts of bells and whistles the closer we get to the place. Almost there, I promise.
Azaka, gesturing, looked like a mime who'd just encountered an imaginary wall. Clyde understood his barrier gestures instantly. Although she didn't know where they were traveling, she realized they'd been in this general area a few days ago. The Tikas dashed ahead and stood before the halfling.
Aubrey knows who we are. She's not going to want to see us.
Clyde said. Her siblings looked at her with alarm.
How do you know her?
Azaka muttered, aghast. He turned to Mitra.
What did you tell him, miss?
The halfling's cool composure was disappearing, though he never raised his voice.
Who's Aubrey?
Mitra had remained quiet since she'd first met these people. Though she felt nervous, she mustered some confidence.
I thought you were taking us to Sheer.
Rukaryu, Niwa, and Aiden all visibly reacted, remembering the name they'd heard Aubrey call when they'd been breathlessly attempting to hide. How did this freed slave woman know this person? Azaka looked at this group, who knew more than he'd expected, and sighed. Feeling dumbfounded, he decided not to ask further questions. Instead, he'd resume his ranger duties.
Come along. We be there real soon. Y'all need to follow me and not wander into no magic spots.
Who is Sheer? We've heard of her.
Niwa said to Mitra.
I don't know.
Mitra answered.
I've heard she frees Tikas and has scouts who work for her. I need to meet her.
She stopped short of mentioning the woman might know where her children are.
I thought Aubrey was a farmer. I didn't realize she worked for anybody else.
Niwa was looking for evidence of the magic spots the halfling had mentioned. Aiden taps the halfling on the shoulder.
Hey, Zach, who is Sheer?
He felt emboldened to have invented a nickname. He never wanted to admit he found some names confusing and difficult to pronounce. Azaka felt vulnerable. He was studying the ground self-consciously. The shoulder tap surprised him. And then seeing the words on Aiden's lips surprised him even more.
Y'all don't know? Mama be calling me Zach, too. That woman is a damn hero. May as well be the god of the Tikas, all the good work she done for 'em. For all of us.
Mitra's eyes widened. She was determined to meet this woman. Had Azaka referred to her as his mother? Could the Tikas savior be a halfling?
She's a god?
Aiden stopped walking. He rarely heard that word tossed around, only in solemn or hushed tones like a profanity.
Course not.
Azaka saw the human's look of consternation.
Never did understand why some folks be fearing that word. Ain't it supposed to be a good word, like a miracle or prayer or whatnot?
Aiden thought the halfling had offered an easy answer to something he'd always found complicated or obscene to talk about. He never would have asked Gorham this question, and even Saba would have changed the subject had he asked. But the idea that prayer could be a good thing validated him deeply.
Here's one.
Azaka pointed, drawing a theoretical line between two large rocks.
Aubrey's place be just up that hill, out the valley. Why y'all say she won't be seeing ya?
The halfling didn't wait for an answer. The siblings were observing some fallen leaves that had accumulated against the invisible wall of one of Aubrey's barrier spells. But he looked beyond where he'd pointed, and seen a pair of skeletons lumbering slowly towards them. From his pocket, Azaka pulled a handful of shiny blue stones and a sling. He raced into action, deftly jumping on Shulfi's back. They skirted a rock that might have been the anchor to the barrier, then continued behind the magic field.
What are those?
Niwa asked nervously.
How are we so damn popular?
Aiden groaned, drawing his sword. He chased after Azaka.
Pincer maneuver!
Rukaryu shouted, pointing to the opposite slope to people who didn't look like slavers or town guards. He only recognized one person and tensed instantly.
No one gets the honey for free.
The gnome auctioneer shouted from atop the hill. He was staring furiously at Mitra.
Stay with her.
Clyde said to her sister. Grabbing her kitchen knife, she raced up the slope with Rukaryu, taking cover behind rocks and trees. Niwa wanted to protect Mitra. To her left, the gnome and 2 elves were advancing. To her right, behind the skeletons, 2 humans crested the other slope. She was terrified, but quickly remembered the resolve she'd felt that first morning at the roadhouse.
Mitra, I'm going to summon for help. Please keep an eye out behind us.
Niwa recalled the lines she'd been rehearsing in her head the last 2 days.
That woman uses nasty magic.
Mitra said. She'd seen the woman once before, during a terrible incident in another town up north. She hadn't wanted to think about that ever again. Even though some of her deepest fears were resurfacing, she felt safe among these intrepid young people. From her bag, Niwa retrieved the same glazed dinner plates she had used the other day. The young summoner's voice quavered as she wove an arcane tale.
By the foothills of Silk Rhode, the champion of the Anhas Roadhouse, Mandragora Rose, single-handedly protected friend and foe from a pair of winter wraiths.
One patch of brilliant midday light beamed off the plate and began to grow bigger and brighter as Niwa cast the summon spell. When the light diffused, a tall elven woman emerged from the light. Confused, her attention rested on the gnome and Tikas crouched down beside her. It was surprisingly difficult to discern her shape. The myriad of earth tones and colors splashed across her leather armor, wrapping her hair and skin like camouflage.
Thank you for responding to my summon, Lady Mandragora Rose.
Niwa said excitedly. To the young summoner, this woman certainly looked legendary enough to be the person the roadhouse owner had described.
Where are we?
The woman asked. Seeing the figures moving toward them, she instinctively reached for her spiked chain, which resembled a blade wrapped in living vines covered with sharp leaves and thorns. Niwa was too nervous to explain their predicament. Furthermore, she couldn't ask this person to simply attack at will. She was afraid this potentially great ally was about to leave in frustration. A sudden boom sounded behind her, followed by a shower of magic sparks. The skeletons had stepped on one of Aubrey's ward spells. A burst of rock and dirt and bone exploded in all directions, destroying the skeletons. Before they could take cover, the shrapnel smacked against the invisible barrier behind them. The magic rippled with strange colors as the rocks and bones settled in a pile, then became transparent once again. Niwa looked away from the aftermath of the explosion, bewildered. The impressive woman was studying the barrier.
They destroyed the roadhouse.
Niwa lied.
We're outnumbered. Please help us.
Mandragora Rose looked down at the young woman. This magic barrier had probably just saved their lives. She reconsidered their capabilities. They looked like defenseless children to her, but defensive magic had just blown apart 2 skeletons, and it was the gnome's voice she'd heard in the summon. She then noticed the ornate copper multi-tool the gnome held. It was a well-known fixture of the roadhouse.
Very well.
The elf woman said.
You'll need more cover than that, I'd say.
She removed a shield strapped to her back and tossed it at their feet. In an instant, she dashed up the slope towards 2 ambushing elves who suddenly looked quite surprised. On the next episode, once again, more unknown enemies descend upon the siblings, ready to destroy them. Finding themselves completely surrounded, they split up for the first time to defend themselves on all sides. Aiden and Azaka are the first to draw the fight away from Mitra and the others as they pursue the archer and the necromancer. Both fighters sustain major injuries, but can Aiden heal Azaka in time?
I can do it again. I can do it again. I can save him.
A rescue can be almost impossible in the heat of battle.
Damn, 'cause death ain't bad enough. They got a curse. Tika's something worse.
Chapter 36, Close Range. Next time on Across the Sun. Across the Sun Episode 7 was voiced by Danielle Bouchard as Clyde, Julia Boudreau as Niwa, Bill Robinson as Aiden, Jason Pagano as Rikaru, Daniel Neal as Azaka, Lucian Opila as the Auctioneer, Savra Luz as Mitra, Shannon Brennan as Mandragora Rose. Additional voices by Lucian Opila and Jason Pagano. Narrated by, edited, scored, mixed, and mastered by Thomas Wells. Some sound effects and music acquired from Zapsplat.com and Pond 5.